Hello A-level students, this is the Excel English channel where we have been analysing key texts for your study, particularly if you are a student of the AQA Language and Literature A-level course. This video is looking at one of the texts from the Paris Anthology, and the text in question is Foreign Correspondent by Lennon, and there have been several requests in the comments asking to look at this, so I hope it's not too late for those of you who are trying to revise this text. This is a somewhat challenging text to get your head round, so hopefully we can break it down nicely for you here. The summary. In the text, Lennon is documenting his first visit to Paris, which lasts 5 weeks, describing his impressions of that journey, of seeing tourists and reflections that he made then on Parisian society. Those reflections seem to him now, at the point at which he's writing, quite embarrassingly immature. In his second journey to Paris, which lasts because he spends a significant part of his life there, he describes a sense of anxiety about leaving the comfort of home, which for him is Ireland. His attempts to find a girlfriend, which don't go well, his attempt to find a job, and his attempts really to survive on nothing. So you may not know, but it would help to know perhaps that Lennon was a very successful journalist and filmmaker who made a film called The Rocky Road to Dublin, which is well known in Ireland because of its controversial criticism of Ireland's strict religious society. That is a relevant theme in the text here as well. So in terms of the key context, this is clearly a written, planned, and you might even add to that a crafted text. It is a personal memoir that is written in quite a high literary style. Its purposes, therefore, are entertaining and informative, but it's really that sort of high literary kind of entertainment in that it's supposed to sort of stimulate intellectual thought and reflection. The audience for this text, readers, would be, I would say, well-educated intellectual readers, those with an interest in Lennon or those with an interest in his literary connections. Particularly, he's someone who he had some very high literary friends. Samuel Beckett, I believe, was a friend of his, who is one of the great playwrights of the 20th century. But also people who have an interest in Parisian or Irish culture in the 1950s and the 1960s and are interested in a perspective or representation of how those two cultures compare. The subjects of this memoir are the effects of travel, social conditions, including housing, our favourite people watching, that expatriate lifestyle. There's a kind of representation of romance, and national identity is also a clear subject. But as ever, it's worth remembering that the subject of a memoir is always, to a certain extent, the person writing the memoir and their life and their impressions. And that is present very much in the representations of this text, because Lennon's younger self is the central focus. This text is focused on his impressions of Paris at the time and the way these have influenced the development of his ideas and I guess his personal growth, particularly his personal growth, I suppose, as an intellectual. This memoir represents his growing awareness of a contrast between what you could describe as a parochial and naive Irish view of the world with this exciting Parisian liberal attitude. So Lennon is young, he is inexperienced, he is naive, at least at the point at which he's being described, and he's coming from this Irish society which we know Lennon as a writer was very interested in, which is quite narrow and strict, and he's going to a place like Paris, which is very, to him, a big eye-opener in its liberal and open-minded attitude towards the world. So young Lennon's inner uncertainties, those unrealistic optimisms that he had, and these kinds of clumsy and inexperienced attitudes to romance, these are represented in the text. And I think as readers, we are being positioned or guided to reflect on Lennon as a young and inexperienced man, and to a certain extent we see young Lennon through the eyes of an older Lennon. He is looking back in an autobiographical memoir from a position much later in his life when he can look back at his younger self with a certain degree of detachment and irony. And as readers, we share that position of looking back ironically. Lennon in this text represents and describes Parisian culture, especially the realities of poor student and expatriate lifestyles, and those living conditions that are tough are represented through his description of cheap housing. So this is very much a contrast to those kinds of touristic, glamorous representations of Paris. This is the gritty Parisian underbelly. Let's have a look at some of those distinctive linguistic features. Obviously, the text is too long, really, to give a close analysis, or for you really to analyse in close detail. So hopefully thinking about how the language levels apply generally to the text will enable you to make a meaningful annotation, but also to feel secure thinking about some of those overall linguistic features that are common to the whole of the text. With regard to the grammar, this text is written in the first person and mostly in the past tense because he is reflecting on past events. But there are occasions where the present tense is connected to his current narrative position. And we did talk about that in representations, this idea of looking back from a point in the present to a point in the past. I wince when I read that now, he writes. Very good sentence at perhaps summarising how different perspectives in time can be used to create that ironic detachment and looking back. The first person I is repetitively foregrounded as the subject, and you can link that, of course, to the fact that this is a memoir, and in many ways in a memoir the individual writing is the subject as much as the actual subjects of Paris and Ireland, etc. Deontic modals are used to explore these hopes and anticipations, to kind of explore the thoughts that were going through his head. You know, I would do this, I would do that. His anticipations are very much explored using that deontic modal would. There is complex syntax throughout. These sentences are composed of very lengthy, featuring complex, lengthy adverbial clauses and phrases and relative clauses, and that gives this text quite a density. It is quite a challenging read, and it's obviously aimed at an audience of proficient readers. You could also connect that to the fact that it's a highly crafted literary text. The grammatical constructions are often conjoined by semicolon or colon, which I always think are quite literary punctuation features because they allow sentences to continue in kind of complex ways. With regard to Lexis and semantics, this text has a kind of an elevated diction. Elevated Lexis is chosen. A little collection there: incarceration, importuners, homogenization, obscurantism, archaic phrasing such as possessed of the need. That's quite a kind of an archaic or outdated or old-fashioned phrasing. I won't lie, this text had me reaching for the dictionary on a couple of occasions. There are euphemisms in the text about sexual desire, which he describes as erotic success or having physical designs on his girlfriend. These are kind of euphemistic or indirect ways of talking about his sexual desire or his sexual thoughts. I guess they keep the text, they keep it clean, they keep it polite without being too rude or direct. There are also classical rhetorical devices in this text, parallelisms, metaphors. There's all kinds of figurative devices. Some of the passages are deeply descriptive and almost poetic or high literary level of description. In terms of pragmatics, it's worth thinking about some of those underlying meanings or perhaps the difference between what's directly said and what is really communicated in this text. The text represents, or Lennon chooses to represent speech in the narrative mostly indirectly. So this means that when he's describing something that was said to him, rather than using quotes and reported clauses, he chooses instead to kind of paraphrase their speech indirectly in the flow of his own narrative. And that really, I think, is a feature of memoirs, where what's really important is the impression left on Lennon, or Lennon's memory, or Lennon's recollection, rather than him trying to perhaps accurately identify word for word what was said to him. So Lennon represents his own thoughts also in a similar way, filtering these thoughts that he had when he was younger through his current narrative voice, or the narrative voice being written in the present. So they can retain the tense in which they were written. So here's an example. Perhaps I decided they accepted prostitutes in the way that we accepted drunks. So we have that reporting clause, I decided, which is put in there to make it clear that that is not what he thinks now, it is what he thought then. So it's a way of representing his past thoughts, representing them indirectly, but representing them in a way that works in with his narrative. He occasionally presents thought more freely. 1,000 a year already, he exclaims. That is actually a thought that occurred to him at the time. He doesn't use a reporting clause there to say, I thought. But it's clear to us as we read that this is a way of him capturing the way he thought at the time in a way that kind of runs into his narrative. So it can be difficult sometimes to work out whether you're reading his narrative in the present or his thoughts in the past, because those can be represented in a way that kind of flows in with the flow of the text, and you need kind of contextual clues to interpret that. There are a number of ironies in there which convey that kind of wincing or awkward look back at his own naive youth. For example, he says, I liked to be realistic in my fantasies. If you think about it, to be realistic in your fantasies is by definition an oxymoron, and that, I think, is conveying a sort of whimsical, ironic humour, in that we can agree with Lennon that thinking that you're realistic in your fantasies is something that someone deluded or naive would think, and this is his winking and slightly subtle way of looking back on his past self and having a little chuckle at how foolish he was when he was younger. So in terms of connections, there are, of course, other representations of Paris in the 1960s. That is true in the Pathé newsreel of 1968. It was quite an exciting time to be in Paris, and there was a lot of social upheaval. There are also representations of poverty in Paris, which can be found particularly in Sophia's personal narrative, where she looks out of the train window and sees some really unpleasant poverty in the Paris suburbs, but also in the Seven Ages of Paris, a historical representation of poverty in Paris. It's a kind of niche question that, who knows, could one day appear on a paper. There are descriptions of American tourists in this text, which would make an interesting comparison with Rick Steves' guided tour of the Louvre, or any of those people-watching representations, perhaps where we see more conventional tourists being presented, not always being presented very favourably. They are the walkers, aren't they, in Baxter? And they're given a kind of quite an amorphous, almost threatening description. So representations of tourists. The memoir genre is represented elsewhere in the anthology. I think it's unlikely in an exam question that they would put two memoirs together, because the examiners, for very good reason, favour asking you to compare texts that have markedly different modes. But it's worth thinking about how Lennon's memoir compares with other memoirs, such as Bryson's, which is humorous, Fraser, Cavassoni, and Miller also have conventional uses of the genre. Breathless, the text, has a similar kind of confessional tone, looking back at that's a Nancy Miller text, looking back at a youthful recollections of Paris, and particularly representations of sexual desire and how Paris is seen as a kind of a sexy place, if you like. That is present also in the memoir Miller. So it would be worth maybe looking at the similarities or differences in the language between those two texts. French Milk would be a fantastic comparison because, of course, French Milk has the shared memoir genre that this text has, but of course it has got a markedly different mode because it is a kind of a visual or graphic memoir. Okay, as usual, guys, that is way more than 5 minutes, but gives you a pretty comprehensive overview of this text and some really strong ideas of how you could start tackling the language in it. I advise now that you probably go back and look at a few sections of that text and try and apply some of the ideas in this video to your own annotation of the text. Guys, I hope it's been helpful. Please subscribe to the channel, drop me a positive comment. If there are any other texts that I haven't covered that you think I should prioritize, then please put them in the comments, and when I find time, I will get around to putting videos up on them. All the best with your studies. Good luck. Bye.